In the summer of 1863, the American Civil War reached a pivotal moment. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, a brilliant and audacious commander, decided to take a massive gamble. He led his Army of Northern Virginia on an invasion of the North, pushing deep into Pennsylvania. His objectives were threefold. First, to take the fight out of war-torn Virginia, allowing the fertile Shenandoah Valley to recover and supply his army. Second, he aimed to strike a blow so decisive it would shatter Northern morale, making the war too costly for the Union to continue. A major victory on Northern soil, he reasoned, could force President Abraham Lincoln to the negotiating table. Finally, and perhaps most ambitiously, a stunning success might convince European powers like Britain and France to officially recognize the Confederacy and provide much-needed aid. Lee wasn't just marching to a battle. He was marching to end the war on his terms. As Lee's army moved north, the Union's Army of the Potomac was in pursuit. In a dramatic shakeup just days before the inevitable clash, President Lincoln replaced its commander, appointing Major General George G. Meade to lead the massive force. Meade, a cautious and methodical general, now had the immense responsibility of tracking down and stopping Lee's invasion. Neither commander, however, intended for the decisive battle to be fought at the small, unassuming crossroads town of Gettysburg. The meeting there was a complete accident. It started with a rumor. A Confederate division, searching for supplies, heard there was a stockpile of shoes in Gettysburg. As they approached the town on the morning of July 1st, they didn't expect to find the enemy, but they did. The two colossal armies, nearly 160,000 men in total, were about to stumble into the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought in North America. The battle began not with a grand, planned assault, but with a scrappy and desperate holding action. On the morning of July 1st, Union cavalry under the command of Brigadier General John Buford spotted the approaching columns of Confederate infantry west of Gettysburg. Buford was a tough, experienced cavalryman, and he immediately recognized the strategic importance of the high ground south of the town hills and ridges named Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Ridge. He knew that if the Union Army could hold that ground, they would have a powerful defensive advantage, so he made a critical decision. Despite being vastly outnumbered, he ordered his troopers to dismount and fight like infantry, deploying them in a series of delaying actions along the ridges west of Gettysburg. Their rapid-firing carbines gave the arriving Confederates the false impression they were facing a much larger force, buying precious time for the Union infantry to hurry toward the sound of the guns. As Buford's cavalrymen were being slowly pushed back, the first corps of the Union infantry began to arrive, led by the highly respected and aggressive Major General John Reynolds. Reynolds quickly took command, directing his troops into the fight to support Buford and secure the high ground. The battle intensified dramatically, spreading along the ridges north and west of the town. Tragically, in the opening hours of the main infantry fight, General Reynolds was shot and killed, a stunning blow to the Union leadership on the field. Without his guiding hand, the Union command structure became fragmented. Throughout the late morning and afternoon, more and more troops from both sides poured onto the battlefield, turning the initial skirmish into a full-scale, chaotic engagement. The fighting was fierce and bloody, swaying back and forth across the fields and woodlots. Despite their initial heroic stand, the Union forces were ultimately overwhelmed. As more Confederate divisions arrived, they launched coordinated assaults on the Union lines from the north and west. The Union 11th Corps, positioned north of town, collapsed under the pressure, triggering a wider retreat. By late afternoon, the Federal lines broke completely. Union soldiers were forced into a desperate, chaotic retreat back through the streets of Gettysburg itself, suffering heavy casualties and losing many prisoners for the Confederates. It was a moment of triumph. They had won the first day's fight, driven their enemy from the field, and captured the town. It seemed as though Lee's gambit was paying off. However, the victory was incomplete, and that small detail would change everything. As the broken Union units streamed back through Gettysburg, they didn't just keep running. They were rallied and redirected by determined officers onto the very ground that General Buford had identified as crucial hours earlier, the high, fishhook-shaped line of hills and ridges south of town. They scrambled to form a new defensive line along Cemetery Ridge, anchoring their right flank on the steep, wooded slopes of Culp's Hill and their left near to smaller hills known as Little Round Top and Big Round Top. By nightfall, the Army of the Potomac held a superb defensive position. They had lost the town, but they had secured the heights. This gave them the critical advantage of interior lines, allowing them to shift troops and artillery quickly to meet any threat. Lee's army was now faced with the daunting task of attacking an entrenched enemy, holding a superior position. The accidental collision at a crossroads had set the stage for 2 more days of brutal conflict, and the fate of the nation hung precariously in the balance. The first day was over, but the Battle of Gettysburg had only just begun. The second day of battle, July 2nd, saw the conflict escalate dramatically. The focus shifted from a meeting engagement to a full-blown, coordinated assault by the Confederates. General Lee's strategy was to attack the Union flanks, believing they were the weakest points. He tasked his trusted subordinate, General James Longstreet, with striking the Union left, while another force would hit the right. Longstreet's assault on the Union left flank kicked off in the late afternoon and unleashed some of the most savage and iconic fighting of the entire war. The landscape itself became a character in the drama. Names that would live in history were about to be written in blood. The battle surged through the peach orchard, where Union General Daniel Sickles had controversially advanced his corps, creating a vulnerable salient. This move drew Longstreet's men in, and the fighting became a chaotic whirlwind. From the peach orchard, the combat spilled into a nearby field of wheat. The wheat field, as it became known, changed hands multiple times in just a few hours. It was a maelstrom of bayonets, bullets, and cannon fire, with regiments from both sides charging and countercharging, leaving the ground littered with casualties. It was a slaughterhouse, a testament to the brutal, close-quarters nature of the day's fighting. Just beyond the wheat field lay a jagged, rocky ridge known as Devil's Den. This labyrinth of massive boulders became a sniper's paradise and a fortress for defenders. Confederate sharpshooters, particularly from Alabama and Texas, took cover among the rocks, picking off Union officers and artillerymen. The fighting here was desperate and personal, as soldiers scrambled over the treacherous terrain, battling for every inch of ground. The Union forces were eventually pushed out of Devil's Den, but at a tremendous cost to the attackers. But the key to the entire Union left flank was a pair of hills called the Round Tops. Little Round Top, in particular, was the extreme end of the Union line. If the Confederates could take it, they could place their artillery there and enfilade the entire Union position, potentially rolling up the line and winning the battle. In a dramatic race against time, Union General Gouverneur K. Warren, Meade's chief engineer, spotted the impending Confederate advance from the summit. He frantically called for reinforcements. Colonel Strong Vincent, commanding the Union brigade, recognized the urgency without waiting for formal orders. He rushed his men, including the famous 20th Maine, up the rocky, wooded slope of Little Round Top, arriving just moments before the Confederates. The fighting was ferocious. The Alabamians under General Lowe repeatedly charged up the hill, only to be thrown back each time. On the far left of the Union line, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his 20th Maine found themselves defending the very end of the entire Federal Army. After repulsing several determined assaults, the men from Maine were nearly out of ammunition. Their ranks were thinning, and another Confederate charge was forming at the base of the hill. In a moment of sheer desperation and tactical brilliance, Chamberlain made a fateful decision. He ordered his men to fix bayonets. In a stunning maneuver, the left wing of the regiment swung down the hill like a closing door, catching the exhausted Confederates by surprise. This audacious bayonet charge swept the attackers from the slope, securing Little Round Top and saving the Union flank. The heroism displayed, there was a critical turning point on the second day. While Longstreet's men were battering the Union left, another major assault was unfolding on the opposite end of the battlefield. General Richard Ewell's Confederates launched a series of attacks against the Union right flank, anchored on Culp's Hill and East Cemetery Hill. The fighting here was just as intense, continuing long after darkness fell. The terrain on Culp's Hill was steep and heavily wooded, making the assault incredibly difficult. Union troops, entrenched behind strong breastworks, poured a devastating fire into the advancing Confederates. Despite repeated charges that raged late into the night, the Union line on the right, like the one on the left, ultimately held firm. By the end of July 2nd, the battlefield was a grim scene of exhaustion and carnage. Tens of thousands of men were dead or wounded. Lee's grand plan to break both Union flanks had failed. The Army of the Potomac had bent, but it had not broken. The line was still intact, a fishhook of blue stretching from Culp's Hill to the Round Tops. The stage was now set for the third and final day, a day that would decide the fate of the battle and, perhaps, the nation. July 3rd dawned with a sense of grim anticipation. General Lee, having failed to break the flanks, was convinced that the Union commander, General Meade, must have weakened his center to reinforce the wings. Based on this assumption, Lee formulated a new, daring, and incredibly risky plan, a massive frontal assault against the very heart of the Union line, on Cemetery Ridge. It was a tremendous gamble, one that would become the most famous and controversial charge in American history. Before the infantry could advance, Lee planned to shatter the Union center with a massive artillery bombardment. Around 1 p.m., the afternoon calm was broken by the thunderous roar of over 150 Confederate cannons. It was the largest artillery duel of the war. For nearly 2 hours, the air was thick with smoke, shrapnel, and the deafening sound of explosions as Confederate guns pounded the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. The Union artillery, under the command of General Henry Hunt, initially responded in kind. However, Hunt astutely ordered his guns to cease fire gradually, creating the illusion that they had been destroyed, and luring the Confederates into a trap, all while conserving ammunition for the inevitable infantry assault. Believing the Union artillery had been silenced and the infantry demoralized, the Confederates prepared to advance. Around 3 p.m., the order was given. From the woods of Cemetery Ridge, a massive line of Confederate soldiers emerged, stretching over a mile wide. Approximately 12,500 men stepped out into the open fields, beginning their march towards the Union line nearly a mile away. The division commanded by Major General George E. Pickett gave the charge its famous name, though his 3 brigades were only part of the larger attacking force. They marched with parade ground precision, their battle flags waving, a magnificent and terrifying sight. But their target was a formidable one. They had to cross 3/4 of a mile of open, slightly uphill ground, directly into the face of the waiting Union army. As they crossed the Emmitsburg Road, the conserved Union artillery on Cemetery Ridge, a little round top opened up with a vengeance. Canister and shell ripped horrific gaps in the advancing gray lines. Men fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds, but the survivors closed ranks and pressed on, their objective a small clump of trees on the ridge. As the Confederates got closer, the Union infantry, protected by a low stone wall, rose and unleashed a devastating volley of rifle fire. The orderly Confederate lines disintegrated into a chaotic mass of men, stumbling forward through a storm of lead. The charge was faltering, breaking apart under the relentless, concentrated fire. Yet, incredibly, a small number of them, perhaps a few hundred, managed to push through the maelstrom. Led by General Lewis Armistead, who put his hat on the tip of his sword to rally his men, this small group of determined Confederates actually breached the Union line. They surged over the stone wall at a slight bend known as the Angle. For a few desperate moments, it seemed the impossible might happen, but the breakthrough was too small, the attackers too few and too isolated. Union reinforcements rushed to the spot, surrounding the beleaguered Confederates. A chaotic hand-to-hand struggle ensued. General Armistead was mortally wounded, and a handful of men who had crossed the wall were quickly killed, captured, or driven back. The attack had failed. The survivors of the grand charge streamed back across the fields they had just crossed so proudly, suffering terrible casualties on their retreat. The ground was covered with the dead and dying. The failure of Pickett's charge marked the climax of the Battle of Gettysburg. This moment, at the Angle, is often called the high water mark of the Confederacy. It was the closest the South ever came to achieving a decisive victory on Northern soil and, in the eyes of many historians, the turning point of the entire American Civil War. From this point forward, the Confederacy would largely be on the defensive, its hopes for ultimate victory fading with the smoke over the fields of Gettysburg. On the morning of July 4th, the day after Pickett's charge, a heavy rain began to fall over the fields of Gettysburg. It washed over the landscape, a somber scene of devastation. For the Union soldiers, it was a day of grim satisfaction. For the Confederates, it was the start of a long, agonizing retreat. General Robert E. Lee knew his campaign was over. His army was shattered, his hopes of a decisive victory on Northern soil utterly crushed. He had no choice but to gather what was left of his forces and begin the arduous journey back to Virginia. The retreat itself was a harrowing ordeal. A 17-mile-long wagon train of wounded men stretched across the rain-soaked roads, a testament to the battle's ferocity. The cries of the injured mingled with the rumble of wagon wheels and the plodding of exhausted soldiers. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had marched into Pennsylvania with confidence and high hopes, but it would limp back south, forever changed. They would never again mount such a large-scale invasion of the North. The high-water mark of the Confederacy had been reached, and now the tide was receding. The human cost of the 3-day battle was staggering, almost incomprehensible. When the final tallies were made, The combined casualties for both the Union and Confederate armies exceeded 51,000 men. This number includes the killed, wounded, missing, and captured. To put that in perspective, in just 72 hours of fighting, more American soldiers became casualties than in many other entire wars. Gettysburg earned the grim distinction of being the single deadliest battle of the American Civil War. The fields and ridges that had been pastoral landscapes were now consecrated ground, soaked in the blood of a generation. For the Union Army of the Potomac, the victory was costly, with over 23,000 casualties. But they had held their ground, defended their homes, and inflicted a devastating blow on the invaders. They could absorb their losses and replenish their ranks. For the Confederacy, the losses were proportionally catastrophic. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia suffered more than 28,000 casualties, losing over a third of its total strength. More devastatingly, he lost a significant portion of his experienced command structure, with numerous generals and colonels killed or wounded. These were men the South could not replace. The industrial and demographic advantages of the North meant they could sustain a war of attrition, while the Confederacy, with its much smaller population, was bleeding itself dry. The losses at Gettysburg were a hemorrhage from which the Army of Northern Virginia would never fully recover. Its offensive power was permanently diminished, but the significance of July 4, 1863 extends far beyond the fields of Pennsylvania. As Lee began his retreat, another monumental event was unfolding hundreds of miles to the southwest. On that very same day, the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi, surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. For 47 days, Grant had laid siege to the city, a fortress perched on high bluffs overlooking a crucial bend in the Mississippi River. Its capture was a strategic masterpiece and a vital objective of the Union war effort. The fall of Vicksburg was a catastrophe for the Confederacy. It achieved one of the Union's primary strategic goals: complete control of the Mississippi River. With the river in Union hands, the Confederacy was effectively split in two. The western states of Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana were now cut off from the rest of the Confederacy, unable to send much-needed supplies, food, and soldiers to the eastern theaters of the war. President Abraham Lincoln famously summarized the achievement, stating, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." The twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, announced to a jubilant Northern public on the same day, delivered a one-two punch from which the Confederacy could not recover. It was a strategic alignment of events that was almost poetic in its timing. Gettysburg stopped the Confederacy's most audacious offensive gamble, while Vicksburg dismantled its western strategic foundation. One was a dramatic, bloody defensive stand, the other, the culmination of a long, grinding campaign of maneuver and siege. Together, they represented a fundamental and irreversible shift in the war's momentum. Before these battles, the outcome of the Civil War was still very much in doubt. Confederate armies had won significant victories, particularly in the Eastern Theater under Lee's brilliant leadership. Morale in the North was often shaky. With a growing peace movement and vocal opposition to Lincoln's handling of the war, the Confederacy held onto the hope that it could wear down the North's will to fight, or perhaps secure foreign intervention from countries like Britain or France, who were dependent on Southern cotton. A major Confederate victory on Northern soil, like the one Lee saw at Gettysburg, might have been enough to force a negotiated peace and secure Southern independence. Gettysburg shattered those hopes. The defeat demonstrated that Lee's army, while formidable, was not invincible. It proved that the Union Army of the Potomac, despite its previous setbacks, could and would stand and fight to the finish. The victory sent a massive wave of relief and renewed confidence across the North. The peace movement lost its steam, and support for the war effort was reinvigorated. For the soldiers in the Union Army, it was a profound psychological turning point. They had finally and decisively beaten their legendary adversary on a grand scale. In the South, the news from Gettysburg and Vicksburg was met with disbelief and despair. The dream of a quick victory or a negotiated settlement evaporated. The stark reality of a long, brutal, and likely losing war began to set in. While the Southern people and their armies would continue to fight with incredible tenacity for nearly 2 more years, the path to victory had been closed off. From July 1863 onward, the Confederacy was fighting a defensive war, a war of survival, not a war for expansion or dictating terms. This is why the Battle of Gettysburg, in conjunction with the fall of Vicksburg, is almost universally considered the great turning point of the American Civil War. It was not the end of the war, not by a long shot. Some of the war's bloodiest and most intense fighting was still to come in 1864 and 1865. as General Grant, now in overall command, would relentlessly prosecute the war against Lee in Virginia. But Gettysburg was the point of no return. It definitively shifted the strategic initiative to the Union. From this point forward, the Union would be on the offensive, dictating the time and place of major engagements. The Confederacy was forced into a reactive posture, desperately trying to defend its shrinking territory against an enemy with superior numbers and resources. The Northern victory boosted morale on the home front and in the Army, solidifying the political will to see the war through to its ultimate conclusion, the unconditional surrender of the Confederacy and the preservation of the United States. The 3 days of battle at Gettysburg did more than just decide the outcome of a single campaign. They sealed the fate of the Confederacy. It ended the Southwest's last best hope of winning the war and set the Union on a firm and direct path to final victory. The sacrifice of the more than 51,000 men who fought and fell that was not in vain. It was the terrible price paid to determine the nation's destiny and ensure that, in the words of President Lincoln, who would later visit the battlefield to dedicate its cemetery, government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.